All right. Well, hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. Another installment of the Practical Management or Practical Magic webinar series sponsored by the Practical and Applied Management Committee of LLAMA. That is a mouthful. We are so thrilled to have our guest speaker with us today, Nikhat Ghouse. She joins us from American University. She has an MLIS, but also a master's in organizational development. And she is an organizational development consultant who specializes in organization development, change management, strategic planning, diversity, equity, and inclusion, leadership training, and coaching. So I know the entire committee has been excited selfishly for us to learn from her. So we're excited to have you here, Nikhat. A couple of things, just housekeeping. This webinar is now being recorded and it will be posted on the committee's YouTube channel. So there is a link to that in the chat window. And Nayama, I'm just seeing your chat too. We confirmed that the person with the content is okay with it being shared. So the entire presentation will be able to be shared on the channel, which is very exciting for us. We're going to ask everyone to save questions until the end, just for the ease of the presentation. But if you do have questions, you can go ahead and type them into the chat window. Nayama will be collecting those and making sure we get them answered at the end. If you would like to submit an anonymous question, feel free to send that question directly to Nayama and just indicate that you'd like to ask it anonymously, and we can share anonymous questions that way. And I think that's it for the housekeeping. So one thing I am going to put in the chat window now is a link to a poll. This is something that Nikhat would like everybody to answer if they can, so she can get just a quick read on who's here and where they're coming from. So there's a link in the chat window to a poll. You guys can go ahead and answer that. And I am going to turn it over to our presenter.
Good. Thank you so much, Mary, and thank you for inviting me to give this webinar. So I'm actually going to escape out of this title page so I can show you the results of the poll anywhere, as soon as I remember how to escape. Aha, there we go. Here we go. Let's see. Earlier. So, nope, that's the survey. Let's see. My apologies. This is my first time using this, and now I'm showing everything. Okay, here are responses. Do I forgotten how to okay. We may save this to the end of and hopefully I can figure out where. See, I did this a couple of days ago and I didn't write down the steps. Oh no, let's see. Someone give me a clue in the chat box. Where's my chat box? Aha. Okay.
And it looks like somebody didn't have a chance to respond. Would it be possible to activate?
It should be open until 2 p.m. actually. Is it not open?
Yeah, I think it said it closed.
That's okay. Okay. Let's see. Let's see. No, that's not there.
Oh, the maximum number of responses has been received. So it's possible that there was a limit on the number of responses that could be submitted.
I think it may be 100 or so.
Okay.
We have 100. So here are the results. 1, 2, and 4% about more than 10 people. And then the other results, 12% of the respondents are a librarian of color and who supervise librarians of color as well. Okay. Thanks so much for filling out those quick surveys. I wanted to get some context as to who my audience was and how valuable this session would be for all of you. Thank you. So back to the show. I'm Nikhat, and I'm a librarian at American University and OD consultant. And there are chat questions, but I'm not able to see them. Okay, and thanks for putting in your responses into the chat box. Okay, so let's get started. The mouse is not behaving. Aha. So a little bit about me. I am an OD consultant, and I've worked in libraries for about 19 years. And the only reason I bother listing that because I still, and 3 times this year, still get asked if I'm new to the field. And I'm not. I've been here for a while. So that's a little bit about me. The goals for today's webinar are awareness of the impact exclusion has on marginalized groups, hopefully an increased knowledge and of strategies that you can use, including tools to support inclusive workplace. And my notes are now locked on the computer. Okay. Okay, and at least one concrete action that you can take from hopefully this webinar. All right. So I wanted to start with an audience question. The membership of PAM put out a call for questions, and the first question that we received was about what advice would you give? And the original wording was to someone, and I switched that specifically to leadership of an academic library where the terms diversity and inclusion are narrowly defined. And I wanted to sort of use this as a sort of jumping point to the rest of my presentation. So the word diversity is all-encompassing and focuses on differences. There are many other domains, including issues related to gender, sexuality, orientation, sexual orientation, ability, religious expression or suppression, and so on. Organizations do not necessarily have the resources to create interventions or improvement strategies to respond to all issues. So with that in mind, think about your constituent group, think about verifying a specific question or problem, and then define who your target audience is, and work to find a solution. One example that I thought of within my own organization was a pretty recent example. Our university has created affinity groups for faculty and staff, both racial and ethnic diversity and others. And there was a recent email, a kudos email sent out about the LGBTQ faculty and staff affinity group. And these groups are all relatively new. They're, I think, less than a year old, more or less. And this group, with this being June and Pride Month, they took this great opportunity to join the DC Pride Parade for the purpose of promoting inclusivity. And this is actually, and coincidentally, the first time the university also joined the parade. So one of our co-chairs is a group, in the group is one of our library staff members. And so she worked with our university librarian and provided funding to help with the parade, to be a part of that parade. So think about the strategies for change or improvement often have to be focused on specific issues in order to ensure efficacy, and then look at opportunities to educate, share resources, and look for support beyond the library as well. I hope that answers your question and gives a bit of context to how diversity is all encompassing. If it doesn't, email me, we'll talk. I wanted to begin by giving a bit of context with regards to the buzzwords that we hear so frequently: equity, diversity, and inclusion. So equity is the fair treatment of all members. Diversity is being aware there are human differences, human experiences, and different cultural experiences. And then finally, inclusion is the intentional ongoing effort to ensure diverse individuals fully participate in all aspects of work, and that their participation is valued and respected as members of a community. And these are specifically from the American Alliance of Museums and Dr. Michael Brazel. He's an OD consultant and expert in diversity management. So I'm particularly going to be talking about racial and ethnic diversity. And I once gave a presentation to a small group, and I provided this particular snapshot of how diverse the field is. And this is from 2009, 2010, and I believe this is the census. And I did not put that citation, my apologies. So in 2009, 2010, there were 6,000 African-American librarians, 3,000 Asian Pacific Islander librarians, 185 Native American, and over 3,000 Latino Latinx librarians. So the question I got when I provided this data was, well, what's that in context to, in a broader context? So I didn't have that information then, I have that information now. And the broader context is 6,000 librarians for a population, if we're talking about representing the populations we serve, there are, someone make sure I get this number right, 42 million plus African Americans in the United States during the 2010 census. And there are 6,000 librarians within that same relative time period. So if we're talking about representing the populations we serve, we still have a little bit of work to do. And so the racial makeup of all the populations of color listed here is about just under 30%. Okay. So I wanted to look for something more current, and this is from the American Library Association. ALA members by race, excuse me, or family of origin by percentage. So this is about 74% of the ALA membership in 2017, and that's 37,000 plus members. So of that number, in 2007, and that's, I think that's all I could find, that was the most recent, 0.2% of that number is Black or African American. 3.6%, and that's a small increase from a few years before, is Asian, and 4.7%, which is an actual increase of Hispanic and Latino and Latinx Americans. So when we talk about context, yeah, it would be interesting to see what the state numbers are as well. Thank you. And we talk about not just representation, but representation within the field, not just outward looking, but internally as well to diversify. This is where we are. Okay. So once upon a time, I was a history major, and I'm still very enamored by the whole concept of history, so please bear with me. So when we talk about libraries and representation, we have to go back and think about that libraries were intentionally exclusionary of African Americans, Native Americans, and other populations of color. And marginalized populations had to build their own libraries that served populations of color. And so if we look through this list, Enid Pratt Free Library was probably the first library that gave all residents, quote unquote, access without distinction. And the rest of this list shows that each libraries had to make space, or populations of color created their own collections and resources. And even though this is 53 years ago, Brown versus Louisiana, there are still work to be done with regards to reaching populations of color and giving them representation within our collections, and just in staffing as well. But we have made steps towards inclusion in the field of LIS, and there's no question that marginalized populations have always worked in the field of LIS. So we've always been here as well. So the first African-American librarian was back in 1892. And LIS programs were created by historically black colleges way back into the 1940s. But ALA didn't amend their Bill of Rights until 1961. And so I think that's why even though there's an increasing effort, librarians of color still face significant exclusion over the decades. And one example is the NCCU accreditation by ALA, an organization that was created in 1876, didn't give NCC accreditation until 25 years later. But also marginalized groups within LIS carved out spaces to create communities of professional practice, to discuss and research issues of concern by and for those marginalized groups. So these, the creation of these communities were directly related to the civil rights movements, and you can see the most recent additions are the Joint Conference of Librarians of Color and IDEAL, which is actually happening next month over at Ohio State. So when we talk about inclusion, there's a number of levels that we could be discussing, and the most broadest level is organization. When we talk about an organization, being intentionally inclusive, it means that you're willing to understand that inclusion has to be an ongoing process because there's no reason for a dominant group to change the way things are working because they benefit the dominant group. So what Katz and Miller and their OD consultants, OD and management consultants, and I'm using a couple of their models. So Frederick Miller and Judith Katz. So what can we as managers do to recruit and retain these marginalized populations, and how can an organization create or sustain equitable, inclusive environments? Katz and Miller has discussed that there's no reason for a dominant group to change since the current structure benefits them. Inclusion cannot be an afterthought. We must use and consistently see through the lens of EDI for any of this to change, for any of change to occur. And keep in mind that the default is to fall back to maintaining an exclusionary dominant group. Another quote that another resource that I have recently been reading is from sociologist Dr. Victor Ray, and he has a theory on racialized organization. And he states that organizations are not race-neutral bureaucratic structures. They are a part of a social construct of what we call race. Organizations connect rules to social and material resources. And Ray states that race is constitutive of organizational foundations, hierarchies, and processes. So as librarians, we talk about how libraries are not neutral. And I would add that libraries, too, are built on whiteness and the intentional exclusion of others. So for marginalized librarians, this also includes the work environment. Whiteness and librarians of colors by default work within an organizational structure built by and for a majority. Someone's mic is on, and could you turn it off? You're shuffling paper. So, thank you. The awareness point of this is that marginalized populations, people with their own culture, language, ways of doing things, suppress their own culture and adopt a culture of whiteness to work within libraries. So this is one of the three questions that we received. And the question here is, the audience question is, they work in a library where the staff is pretty diverse, but the library faculty is not. And they're looking for concrete activities to mitigate and moderate the tensions between both groups while affirming and honoring everyone's experiences and expertise, which is tough since that organization has a difficult time retaining populations of color. So one of my first ideas that came up about this particular question was an activity that I did for my own library for a retreat that we had. And that activity was to have the entire group be in a circle, if that's possible, and get the entire group together. And then get to really know each other by asking 3 specific questions and going in a round. So the first question would be about everyone's past. And so in that instance, I asked everyone, how did they find librarianship? So discovering why they came into librarianship. And then asking about something about their present, whether it's librarianship or their broader life experiences. And then third, asking about their future. What are their future goals within or outside of librarianship? And it allows you to get to know people, but it also allows you to really humanize each other and really have time and space to connect with others that you don't necessarily have when you're working day in and day out and faced with other deadlines. So that was one idea that I had, but I wanted to look at organizational culture and discuss some of the things that this question surfaced from that, and which is looking at organizational culture and a few other pieces related to that. So looking at organizational culture, there's 4 models, theories, or frameworks that I'm going to engage in. And the first is interaction safety. So it leads back to the question earlier about how to do this with safety. So we'll talk about that. And then there's the 8 sustaining behaviors of inclusion. And then we'll dig a little into organizational culture or levels of culture and explain how to surface some culture and how to engage in being a part of that change. And then and this is my assumption, based on experience, we don't know how to do conflict well, so I wanted to touch on that a little bit as well. So first is Katz and Miller, or Miller and Katz in this case. They go back and forth in who is first author. So Judith Katz and Frederick Miller, and they define interaction safety as the critical ability to join, connect, and collaborate, and to be able to do our best work. So what that entails is having an awareness that everyone is on the same team, that all members have the intention and competence to add value to the conversation. That's the best solutions are those that include all perspectives, that are engaged in that conversation, to build on others' ideas and not necessarily dismiss or tear them down, and to achieve, to know that to work together means that we can do better work together, are more productive and an effective team than we can as we work alone. So this is based on their book, which I will show, Safe Enough to Soar. It will be listed in the bibliography. And it's actually, if we're talking about organizations and having a base for having that safety in place so that populations of color and marginalized groups have a safety and trust in place to be able to interact safely, then I think this is the basis, the starting point of that work. And we all have had those experiences where we speak up and that engagement is not what you expected. And that ability to want to engage again, we start second guessing that, and it becomes difficult to do so. So this model really helps to engage everyone in being involved and being a productive member of being engaged in safety. Okay, I'll stop babbling. So So with interaction safety, marginalized populations limit risk-taking because the outcome based on experience is unknown. The next is Miller and Katz's 8 sustained behaviors of inclusion. And surprisingly, the first one is actually pretty important. I think with many populations of color, having acknowledgement that your presence is seen and heard, even with a simple hello, not every single time, but that initial first meeting is really important because we've spent, in many cases, we're not acknowledged, we're not engaged, we're passed by, and we're not seen. So that piece is actually pretty important. And to create a sense of safety for you and your team members. So these 8 behaviors, they're created by Katz and Miller based on their 4 decades of work as an OD consultants and management consultants. And so they work with Fortune 50 companies, and this is what they've pulled from their experiences as the 8 pieces of really having individual behavior aligned to these so that there is more interaction safety, that people are seen and heard, and that in particular addressing misunderstanding and disagreements in a time and space, and to be able to build trust. And I think that in particular is pretty challenging to build trust, to do what you say and honor the confidentiality, and if you're not able to have that engagement as to why that didn't occur. Okay. So the next is Edgar Schein, his levels of organization. They explain organizational culture. So this model is a visual that shows the degree of which cultural phenomena can be observed. So as managers, we have a pretty keen eye as to how people interact with each other, and we can see where the difficulties are and we can see where the challenges are. But if you're not aware of that, this is a tool that you can use to bring that to the surface. So starting from the bottom, a basic assumption is an unconscious essence of culture. These are things that are taken for granted and are likely non-negotiable. So if you question a basic assumption, you might get the label of crazy, or a basic assumption is not open for discussion and it's difficult to change. So if you think about your organization and you think about that language of, well, we've always done it that way, and it sort of shuts down the conversation, that might be a basic assumption that you're facing. So values are more visible. They can be discussed, they can be questioned, there's a back and forth to it. There's agreement or disagreement, and all groups, everyone in the group is able to reflect on the original values that this was created upon, and their assumption about what's right, wrong, or effective and ineffective is part of the conversation. And that espoused value won't be adopted as a value until the entire group takes a joint action or can see an observable outcome of the action. And so an example of that would be goals or philosophies of an organization. So finally, an artifact are what's on the surface, and includes things like visible products of a group, such as language, style as embodied in clothing, manner of dress, display of emotion, or visible behavior of the group, and the organizational processes that which such behavior is made routine. So artifacts are difficult to decipher to the outside observer, and especially without knowing the underlying assumptions. So as let's say, for example, as a new marginalized, someone new to the organization, marginalized or not, let's say they walk into a new organization and everyone goes to a coffee break, everyone at 10 a.m. But no one's told the new employee. So how does that work? How does he or she pick up those cues other than to ask questions? And at the artifact and espoused values level, those questions will likely be answered. But at the basic assumption level, that might not be the question to ask. But if you don't know the culture, the best thing to do is ask, but at the same time, that can be seen as challenging, and that puts you in a difficult position. So this is a pretty brief overview of the layers of culture within an organization. So I thought about this in particular, and I had some conversations about why, how a manager could take that information and take a critical eye to organizational culture. So things to do or things to consider is question statements. So if you're at a point in an organization where you can ask why, you can challenge those questions. Why have we've always done things this way, or we've tried that X years ago. You can, as a manager, comfortably ask those questions as a person in leadership or as a person from a dominant group, and to offer marginalized employees the understanding of organizational history. Libraries have deep, complex histories, and they go back decades and decades and decades. A lot of it is assumed to be understood, but as a new employee, especially someone from a marginalized group, it's not always clear. And so how do you surface that by asking questions? But it's also good for the manager to provide these answers. So for example, so I supervise resident librarians. And so if we go into a meeting, I'll ask them if they have any questions about the meeting. And if they have questions, we'll discuss what happened in that meeting and why. And if there's a history behind the question, and if I have that history knowledge, I'll provide those answers. So the other thing, and I'm going to go into this a bit more in just a bit, is, and my computer locks out again, is to look at exclusionary behavior within meetings. Oh, good, it's not locked out. And to think about setting a tone. So with exclusionary behavior, it's important for managers to think about what is acceptable behavior and what is not. So the examples I can think of is, so let's say someone reacts to something another person says, and let's say their response is, well, I think that's dumb, making it personal. So how do you engage with that? And how do you, one, not ignore it? Because ignoring it means that you're going to be, you're complacent. You're allowing this behavior to go on. And it's setting a tone that tells everyone that this behavior is acceptable and that I can speak to this person this way because no one has reacted, no one has said anything. And those experiences, marginalized group have those experiences pretty much on a daily. So you can't be complacent, but you can't be complicit to this either. So finding a way to set behaviors in advance so that if someone, so using those 8 behaviors earlier, if someone does go out of bounds, you can say either community guidelines or meeting ground rules that this behavior is not acceptable. And if there is agreement on community guidelines, that should be enough, theoretically. Is there other work to be done behind the scenes? Yes, absolutely. That those in that group may not be aware of course. But in that time and place, if it's not addressed, it sets the tone and it changes group dynamics. for into the future. Okay. How much time do I have? Am I good? I'm good. Okay. So the last piece I wanted to talk about was conflict. And believe me, I'm not a fan of conflict either. But at the same time, if something were to happen, I think I've come, working in the field long enough, I've come to a point where I've just barely been able to say, hey, hold on, let's stop and let's talk about this, because this is, we certainly have a disagreement. We have a differing of opinions. So there are two kinds of conflict. So this conflict is, based on human differences, is productive. It's comes from a place of inclusion. It embraces differences at work and life that enhance the organization. This conflict, where is based on interests, perspectives, experiences, abilities, and so on, is a healthy conflict that enhances performances. So having an open discourse where people are open to hearing another perspective and having that conversation, and not shutting down of conversation, is what this is describing. So the other is diversity conflict based on oppression. So that's defined as conflict between dominant and marginalized groups, whether it's from racism, sexism, or heterosexism, and others, of course. So this is oppression. It's a combination of prejudice and power, and exercised by dominant groups over marginalized groups. And society, power and organizations in society to influence and control resources, establish sanctions, rules, or policies, or laws. Whether this is intentional or unintentional, this to deny someone privilege, power, recognition, and opportunity. This is that oppressive conflict. So with marginalized groups, we don't have these powers. We don't set these norms, the institutional norms, values, customs, laws, and behaviors. For the most part, those were already built on whiteness before we were involved. So not having that power, the conflict in dominant groups, there's a greater influence by dominant groups in the outcome, since most positions of power are filled by dominant groups. Okay, so this is actually a visual as well. I'm a pretty visual learner, so I like to toss in visual examples as much as possible. So diversity conflict based on human differences, and diversity conflict based on oppression. So we had one last question, and I'm almost done. Okay, and that is, this question is from an audience member that they're fortunate to have a diverse group, but it's still a little lonely, and thoroughly understand that. What can I do as a manager to help with this issue? So my first thought was to suggest team building activities. If you're a relatively large group, I'm going to assume 5 to 10, if not something around that point. There's a number of good activities where you get to know your team members a bit more, and not just in the work setting, but get to know them as people, as deeply complex as any other individual. So that would probably be my first suggestion, and also to look at what your department or organizational goals are, and how your team members can can be a part of that in the sense that their perspectives are each unique and different, and get to know where their skills are and where they can grow. Okay. So, and if I did not give enough suggestions for that, I'm happy to email with you or chat with you to provide an answer or an additional answer. There's a lot of good team building activities. There's, and if you guys work in teams frequently, that would be helpful as well to have that in the background. Okay, so additional tools for you all to consider. The ladder of inference. It's a tool of it's a model for a thinking process that helps bring individuals to better consciousness or to better conclusions. There's also Johari's window, which is Joe Luft and Harry Ingram. It's named after their first names. And it's a 4-panel window. And the goal of that is to increase self-awareness while reducing the unknown by using observations by others, self-discovery, and mutual enlightenment. It's a great tool to use between manager and employee if that's something for consideration. The other is NVC, nonviolent communication, and that's a 4-part communication framework based around compassionate communication created by Marshall Rosenberg. And then finally, there's a lot of different coaching models that you can use. Almost all of them are based on the GROW model, which is goals, reality, options, and way forward. And there's a whole book on that as well. And I think that's all in the bibliography. That's it for me. Hopefully I stayed under time. And I assume there are more questions, and hopefully I'll be able to answer a few of them before time is up. Okay.
Yeah, this is Mary again. Thank you so much. That was, there is so much there to chew on. And people have been asking too if there will be a bibliography. Are the slides something that you might be able to share maybe as a link, and we could put it up with the YouTube video?
Yes, the bibliography is in the PowerPoint as well, but
Great.
I'll pull it up on here for you.
Awesome. So we did have one question from someone earlier in the chat. They asked, so honest responses take courage and trust. And this is when you were talking about, I think, talking with your teams about your backgrounds. Mm-hmm. Did you find any hesitancy from attendees in opening up and sharing their stories?
In context to, I'm missing.
That was when you, earlier when you were sharing the scenario of getting the teams together and talking about their backgrounds and where they come from. Mm-hmm.
The past, present, and future?
Yes.
Okay. Everyone in that retreat, except for one individual, was game about sharing their past, present, and future ideas.
That's great. And how did the one person who was not comfortable sharing, did they
They participated in the first two, just not in the future piece.
Okay. And did that serve to single them out in any way? Is that something that would have made somebody feel more vulnerable, not wanting to share?
No, I think that individual was comfortable not sharing, so everyone accepted that this was a point that they couldn't go past, and
yeah,
it was pretty accepting.
Yeah, that's great. That's great to hear. It's great to hear, kind of foregrounding those conversations that I think people are sometimes scared to have. Another question that showed up in the chat window, I'm interested in learning how other managers have used value statements as a point of reference in difficult conversations.
Okay. Can I get a little more information?
That was from a participant in the chat window.
Okay.
So if the person who asked that question would like to give a little more context. And while we're waiting for that, Shannon asks, and this is circling back to the sharing discussion, would you say it's important to say for that circle activity that participants can share as little or as much as they want at the start of the activity?
Yes, and some responses were a little on the superficial side, but others were um, deep sharing. So, and I think at the end, a number of people came up to me afterwards and said, "This was really great. I did not know that some of my colleagues had this background or had these experiences, and I want to go in and talk to them about it."
That's great. And do you think too, and I'm just jumping in here, this wasn't a question from anybody, but do you think it's important to, continue to have those conversations, right? You don't just have them once, but you kind of have them on an ongoing basis. Is that something that you recommend?
Absolutely. I think it's difficult to get to know your colleagues. You have a full workload, you have, 8-9 hours a day of nonstop work. And you look up and you realize, that colleague has been in my office 3 times in the entire time I've been in that office. And you wonder, is that some work that you need to do, or is that work that the other individual needs to do? And how do you meet people in the middle when you don't really know them or haven't had anything beyond superficial conversations? And how do you do that without sounding like a poor choice of words, a creeper? But I think with most people, when you ask questions to get to know people, you can easily see the sincerity. Mm-hmm. And not sincere, that is also easily seen.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So I'm going to circle back to the value statements. So the original question was, I'm interested in learning how other managers have used value statements as a point of reference in difficult conversations. And then the follow-up response, the more information was, we have a robust value statement as part of our strategic plan, and I have found it very valuable. So I guess the question there is kind of, is it helpful to state, explicitly the types of values that your organization espouses, and use those if you find that maybe people aren't meeting those values?
I think that is something to consider, especially if everybody was involved in creating these value statements.
Oh, good point. Yeah.
That means that they're invested in maintaining those statements and enacting them and living them. And that those are opportunities when we use sway or sway away from them. You can go back to that and say, so this is what we all agreed on. This is what we work towards, and see how to course correct if necessary.
I think that's a really great way of looking at it. I think I'm just personally, I was watching, it's like my jaw kind of hit the desk on a lot of it. The part where you said that, and I'm probably going to be misstating this, that people of color feel pressure to assimilate into the dominant culture when they come into an organization rather than express their own culture. And, like that was almost kind of horrifying for me to realize, how much privilege I live in as a white person, especially. So, what recommendations do you have for people to be able to not, build a culture where people don't feel like they have to do that? Is it just kind of the things you've been talking about, talking to each other, or are there specific leadership strategies that really encourage people to not feel that pressure?
I think first is just self-awareness of that knowledge, and you just mentioned that this was new to you, and I think that's one of the reasons I like Katzenmiller's eight behaviors. It becomes something tangible, and I'm someone that really likes examples and products that I can put into practice into my life, and check back with, so that I can see that I'm trying, or I can see that I'm growing in that area. But I think for leadership, I think it's really important, managers, leaders, to have that awareness, because marginalized or not, we have a privilege of guiding and influencing and impacting someone's career, and that's a lot of weight to carry. And if we're not conscious of those individuals and where they want to go professionally, how are we going to support them? And I think for marginalized groups, that is a particular sticking point, because finding appropriate mentors who understand them who understand where they're coming from and where they would like to go is few and far between. You know, I've been described as a quote unquote interesting mentee. Still don't know what that means.
Sure. And I mean, like the statistics that you showed alone, right, in terms of the number of people of color that are in the profession, are there even enough people to mentor people of color in their career goals like that?
But I think everyone, regardless of color or marginalization, if you're in a leadership position, you're in a position of responsibility to mentor, coach, and guide your employees. That's a career changer for people. If you have that support, in many cases, that hasn't existed before.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And that's that's a lot of responsibility. Like I as a leader, as a supervisor, as a manager, you're not just responsible for the operations of the organization, right? That we kind of have an obligation to support our employees on a lot of different levels. Mm-hmm. So that's a really great point. Are there other questions from the attendees or comments or resources they want to share? Oh, and yep, we had the question, will the statistics of marginalized people in libraries be shared again? And I think that'll be available both in the recording and in the slides.
Yes. You're welcome.
So while we're waiting to see if any other questions come in, I actually have an evaluation link that I'm going to put in the chat window right now. If you guys can just take a minute or two before you leave, this is really helpful feedback for the committee as we plan these webinars every month based on questions that people have submitted to us. So we know we're trying to present webinars that meet people's needs. So the feedback form will tell us if this is meeting your needs and what additional needs you might have. But we can continue to hang out here and see if anybody has any questions. It's such an important topic in a lot of layers, and especially with what's been happening at the organization, ALA wide. And do you find that people are uncomfortable with these conversations, or that they're reluctant to engage in these conversations, or that they feel defensive? Like, what's the best way for people to initiate these conversations with their coworkers?
I do find people uncomfortable with talking about it, and well, I'll take the example of getting this degree in organization development. I was in a cohort with 11 other people, and about half of the population were people of color, and the other half were from dominant culture groups. It was difficult for us to get past the word diversity. And we were required to intentionally sit and talk with each other, literally required. And every time we talked about diversity, it was that big word, and it was the 5 or 6 people from marginalized backgrounds, bearing their chest. Mm-hmm. And after a while, that becomes quite a bit of a burden. And the others, if you can't get past that word, how can you talk about it? And so I think doing reading or having, hopefully other people of color and from marginalized group that you can safely say, I've always wanted to ask this, and I've been afraid to, or I've been hesitant. Do you have some time to help me with this? And ask that question or two, or have a conversation over coffee, and make sure that individual is comfortable giving you that emotional labor, because it is work for the people to be talking about their life experiences in a marginalized group.
Yeah, that's a great reminder too. Absolutely. Well, I haven't seen any other questions come in, but I have seen lots of thank yous and lots of people saying how helpful this was. So, and I have to concur with that completely. Thank you so much. Oh, here's a couple of last questions. So how do you signal to prospective employees in an interview setting that your organizational culture struggles with inclusivity?
In the circles where I work with relatively new librarians, I encourage them to ask the question, how would you describe your organization's culture?
Mm.
And that is a very difficult question for dominant groups to answer. For people of color, it's a little bit easier. Not much, but it's a little bit easier. There's always a pause. And when you ask that question not just of individuals, but ask that question of groups and ask that question of leadership. And especially in groups, observe the behavior and see what the reactions are. And that's going to be telling as an interview, that will tell you what that culture is for you.
Mm-hmm. And the person who asked that question followed up, especially if you're asked point blank in front of your supervisor. So I think this person is asking, how do you signal to a prospective employee that this is maybe not the most inclusive environment, or that this organization that struggles with creating an open culture?
I think that's every organization, though.
Yeah.
And I think most marginalized groups are more than aware of that. And they're just looking for the opportunity that best fits their skills and their professional needs. And if that's that organization, then maybe that will be a match. But every organization struggles with inclusivity, every organization.
I don't know if that's reassuring or super depressing. Probably a little bit of both.
It's a growth area for all of us.
And then a follow-up question, or another question, is that conversation about diversity a good place to surface invisible marginalized identities? So when you start talking to people about their experiences and their culture.
I think so, especially if that space is working on being inclusive. So if the language that you hear is full of awareness and curiosity, and you feel comfortable divulging that or contributing to that conversation about invisible identities, then give it a try.
Yeah, that's a great question. And a question, as a manager, should you set the tone by disclosing? Do you find that to be helpful?
Disclosing the lack of...
I'm assuming maybe an invisible identity.
In a private conversation with candidates, you mean?
Oh, just talking about as part of when you're having conversations with your team, as trying to create a culture of openness, right? And everybody's discussing their backgrounds, and then trying to surface invisible, marginalized identities. Should the manager set the tone first by disclosing their own invisible identity?
I think it would depend on how the manager has previously engaged with that same population. So if you have a record of being open, then this won't be a difficult conversation. But if you've been unavailable from the get-go, that shift maybe needs to be more gradual.
That's a good point. So maybe work on opening up in general first.
Maybe with individuals, with your team individually, and then slowly with the whole group. Because that's a personality change for all intents and purposes.
Mm-hmm. And then the person is following up asking about how about for new managers who are new to a team?
To disclose?
Mm-hmm.
As a new manager, you get to set the tone. You get to be as open or as available as you want. And that in itself is an opportunity. Everybody has a clean slate. What do you want to write down?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. All right, well, it's 2:00, so I just want to thank everybody again for coming. Nikhat, thank you so much. This has just been a wonderful experience. And thank you for being so open and willing to field all of our questions.
Absolutely.
So we will be publishing this to our YouTube channel, and Nikhat, after I stop the recording, I will see about getting the slides from you to see if we can share those also. The committee will be taking the month of July off for webinars, and then we'll be regrouping in August with a new series. So stay tuned to the listservs and announcement places for more updates. But thank you all so much for being here, and thank you especially to Nikhat.
You're welcome. Thank you. Bye-bye.